Hi guys, welcome back to my channel, and today we're going to talk about Stephen King's first ever short story anthology, Night Shift. If you're new here and enjoy this video, then please, by all means, like, comment, subscribe. As a new fan of King myself, I've become a bit obsessed, if you remember from my video on Salem's Lot, so I promise you, this probably isn't going to be the last video that I make about his works, because I'm in a bit of a tailspin now. I must admit, I feel like the short story genre itself doesn't get the appreciation that it deserves. Modern reading culture is so novel-centric, and I think we forget the value and the talent that goes into making a story really sort of grab your attention and satisfy you in like 50 pages or less. Like when you think of writers like Chekhov, Kafka, Maupassant, their contributions to storytelling as an art form is most notably demonstrated in their short stories. And while Stephen King is probably more famous for his feature-length books, Carrie, The Shining, etc., I think it's naive to overlook his smaller body of work, his anthologies. In the foreword, which was written 25 years before I was born, King talks about the horror genre and the universality of fear. He explains that the reason we find fear so enticing is because in a way it reminds us about our own mortality and the fact that we're all going to die one day. And so it's cathartic when we experience the macabre vicariously through stories about other people. I think he really hits the nail on the head with that morbid curiosity aspect, because in our everyday lives, if we hear that somebody's fallen into a wood chipper, mixed in with our initial disgust and shock, there's at least 5% fascination at what that would look like all their innards sort of spraying out the other end. And this is what Stephen King is alluding to. He knows we don't believe in the supernatural, werewolves and vampires, but we still crave the drama of that, and a small part of us wishes that we really could hear things go bump in the night. He also talks about the social context of horror, how we can learn a lot about the zeitgeist of any given generation by what the everyday person is most afraid of. I would say this has become way more apparent after World War II, because you have the fear factor of nuclear arms, but also the rise in existentialism. Historically, horror writers like Poe and Lovecraft, they didn't achieve much success until after dying, which makes sense given how morality was institutionalized and there wasn't this free expression of the alternative that we have now. Once we started to move away from traditional values, we could sort of embrace the creativity in horror writing without feeling ashamed or guilty for enjoying it. Even today, there are probably still critics out there who denounce King and the horror genre in general, saying that, it's just a bunch of deviants. But he has undeniably acted as a trailblazer. He's taken this genre out of obscurity and into the mainstream, where people can enjoy these sorts of books without feeling afraid of ridicule. So let's move on to the stories themselves. Our first story in the anthology is Jerusalem's Lot. It makes sense that he would start with this one, because by 1977, The Shining, Carrie and Salem's Lot, they were his three big ones. They were successful enough to make Stephen King a regular salary as a professional writer. And Salem's Lot, as I've already said, I read it. It was the first King I read. If you're unfamiliar with the story, please go watch my review about it on this channel. I talk about the book and the mini-series. You don't want to miss it. But that video is not essential viewing for this one, because the prequel, this short story is actually a prequel and has nothing to do with vampires per se. The town is only really featured as a secondary location because I think we're in the 1850s. It takes a lot of inspiration from Dracula. The whole story is a series of correspondence between Charles Boone and his acquaintance that he calls Bones. I did play with the idea that Bones isn't actually a real person and that Charles is just writing letters to himself because he's in a sort of delirium. I say this because the conversation's very one-sided. We don't ever see any reply letters from Bones, And even their names, like Boone and Bones, they're similar enough that you could speculate that they're the same person and that Bones is just a figment of Boone's imagination. Nonetheless, our main character, Charles Boone, has just moved into his ancestral home of Chapelwaite in the mid-19th century. Townspeople from the local settlement, Preacher's Corner, are horrified because this house has a reputation for being very cursed. They want nothing to do with Charles. They think he's a lunatic for living there. The house seems to mirror the Marston house in Salem's Lot. Through a note in his bookshelf, Charles discovers that the deserted town of Jerusalem's lot, and he decides to pay it a visit. Again, King knows how to capture our morbid curiosity. Charles laughs off any suggestion that Chapelwaite or Salem's Lot could be haunted. The maid, Mrs. Cloris, she's so upset at the thought of him going near the town, but it's that morbid curiosity that draws him into visiting it anyway. When he arrives at Salem's Lot, he's taken aback because it's a very pretty town. He makes a point of saying how teenagers typically, they'll vandalise anything. So to see this empty town perfectly preserved, it really emphasises how imposing the town is, that nobody, not even the kids, will go near it. Apparently still not deterred by that, Boone enters the town's church with his friend Calvin McCann, and they find that the place has been desecrated. The crucifix on the wall's been turned upside down. The Bible is a satanic version written in Latin, in Druidic languages that are undecipherable. On the front it says, "The Mysteries of the Worm." At this point they're quite spooked, so they go back to Chapelwaite, the spooky house. Boone tells Mrs. Cloris what he saw in Salem's Lot. Much to her chagrin, she fills the gaps in his knowledge about his own heritage because this house has been passed down through the Boone family. His great-grandfather, Richard Boone, had a disagreement with his great-uncle about the book and how it broke their family apart. At the same time, Calvin finds Robert Boone's old diary, and he manages to figure out the cipher, because it's written in translation, so that they can figure out what the entries are saying and what happened. The diary starts with "Blessed are the meek," which felt appropriate because heritability seems to be the theme of the story. There's something scary about that scripture, the idea that the meek will inherit the earth, the idea that things that are passed down from one generation to another, there's no control over that. While Boone was originally delighted to have inherited this lovely big house through his family, the Boones, the Boone lineage, he wasn't prepared to deal with the unresolved mystery surrounding the worm. They read through Robert Boone's diary. It causes Boone lots of distress. We see how everybody has now distanced themselves from Philip Boone, the uncle, once he embraced the family legacy of Keeper of the Worm. We find out that several members of the Boone family died quite tragically in Chapelwaite, including Marcella, who had an accident falling down the stairs when she was only a young girl. So Boone starts to fear for his own safety, especially when he goes down to the cellar and sees what appears to be one of his deceased relatives sort of hanging there. Again, very similar to Hubert Marston when Ben Mears finds him in Salem's Lot. Calvin reports that Boone is physically getting weaker, but he's determined to end this sort of evil legacy of the Boones. They go back to Salem's Lot to destroy the book. They find a sacrificial lamb has been slaughtered on the altar. They manage to destroy the Bible, but in doing so, the ground seems to explode beneath them, and this giant worm rises up out of the surface, whoa, and it's got James Boone, the original Keeper of the Worm, over a century and a half ago. Calvin gets injured by the worm, but Charles is so struck with terror that he just runs away. He leaves his friend behind. He runs all the way home, and he falls into a deep, deep sleep. When he wakes up, he vows to never have any children, as the legacy of the worm must die with him in order to stop the evil dead in its tracks. Boone's letters actually stop there, and the story ends with a criticism of Boone's reliability, claiming that he must have suffered with lunacy. The narrator points out two inconsistencies in Boone's account. The first one is that the explosion of the church floor that the big worm came out of, there's no markings in the church to prove this. And secondly, Boone is not the last living descendant of the lineage. Plot twist, the person critiquing this account is Charles Boone's distant cousin, James Robert Boone, named after the one on the worm. It's an interesting dilemma to end on, because you want to believe Charles is telling the truth, but then the keeper of the worm lives on in his cousin. How do we know that when the original James Boone appeared on the altar, that he's not now pretending to be a distant relative, so that he can discredit his account and keep the legacy of the worm going? I feel like you could have a very long debate about this story, and I like that. I like the sort of ambiguity of the ending. Who's right? So let me know in the comments if you think you know what happened here. There's also a television series based on this story. It came out last year called Chapelwaite. I've seen the first couple episodes and I'm enjoying it so far. It's on Paramount Plus. I think I'll talk about that in its own video though, because I want to talk about that at length. Our next story is not as complex. It's titled Graveyard Shift. It's a short one. I did like the brutality of it. You could tell that like Stephen King was working off of some sort of bloodlust when he wrote it, because it's very violent. My mind also went to Salem's Lot again, as this short story heavily features rats, and if you've read the deleted scenes from the original manuscript of Salem's Lot, you know that originally rats had a bigger role in that novel. They even kill one of the main characters, in a similar way to what happens in this story. So our main character, Hall, he's a bit of a drifter. He's started work at a textile mill in Maine, of course. The company is dealing with a bit of a rat infestation, so Hall's boss, Warwick, who doesn't seem to like him very much, he tasks him with checking out the sub-basement area where the rats seem to be coming from. Hall agrees, but requests that Warwick come with him. It's like a battle of wills. When they reach the deepest part of the sub-basement, they find this complete world of rats, a whole colony in the darkness, and as they get deeper, they follow different evolutionary paths, culminating in the queen rat, a giant, limbless, eyeless creature that like births more rats. Now, seeing as characters in the world of King do tend to be quite sadistic, Hall actually uses the hose that he's been carrying to blast his boss, Warwick, into the queen rat's path, where he is swiftly dismembered and eaten. If you thought Hall had a fighting chance of escaping while the rats were distracted with Warwick's body, you'd be wrong. He gets overwhelmed so quickly and is mutilated by the rest of the colony. Meanwhile, the workforce who stayed above ground begin to wonder what's happened to Hall and Warwick. The story ends with them going down to the sub-basement to investigate. So while the story is very short, especially when you compare it to Jerusalem's Lot, that's like about 70 pages, it hits hard on the horror element. But I also think there's like meaningful real-world application, like there is in a lot of these stories. We sort of see this toxic work relationship between a manager and their employee in Warwick and Hall, which then becomes their undoing when they try to betray each other in the sub-basement. Comparatively, this colony of rats, many of whom are blind and limbless, actually function as a much more efficient work unit that sort of capitalises on the prospect of fresh meat. Although the story is like one of the shorter ones in the anthology, that didn't stop Hollywood making an 86-minute film version in the early 90s. Having watched said film, I can tell you it's insane. It's a straight-to-DVD mess that's actually quite entertaining if you love bad cinema. I was actively rooting for the rats because every actor was so characterless and they were just really cruel to the rats. Like in the opening scene, a guy literally like brutally murders a rat. He just like tosses it in the folding machine. So I didn't exactly shed a tear when the rats then tripped him up so he fell into the cotton machine. It felt like the director as well was like rooting for the rats. I did like that the mill they worked at, it was called Bachman's Bill. I thought that was like a Bachman's Mill, pardon. It's a nice reference to Richard Bachman, which was Stephen King's alias that he wrote a bunch of books under. I'm sure we'll talk about that too in the future. What else? The boss, he has an affair with one of the girls who works there, and she dies in one of the funniest pratfalls I've ever seen.
Shit.
I rewatched it multiple times because I was cackling at how fake it looked.
Shit.
There's like a creepy exterminator guy. I really thought he would have like more of a purpose in the film, but he just gives us long drawn out speeches about how evil the rats are. The last 20 minutes though, that's the best part because the movie just turns into a comedy. All the survivors, including the arsehole boss, all descend into the sub-basement to tackle the rats. It's not just Hall and Warwick. One guy, he falls into this like bloody water, only it doesn't look like blood at all, and this giant mama rat eats him. And then another guy, he like sticks his arm in like a hole and then he has it eaten off and he's like, ah. It felt like a modern Alien where the whole team was incompetent and all the actors were doing way too much. The mama rat also looks so bad. It's meant to be like tumorous and mutated with like missing limbs and wings, but it's just a big old mess. It's really slimy. The boss and the main guy, they have a fight. The giant rat's chasing them, they don't care. The boss kills main guy's love interest, even though I'm using that term loosely. The girl had like 15 minutes together on screen time. Mama rat kills the boss, main guy escapes and kills mama rat. Her tail gets stuck in the gears of the cotton machine. The film is awful, but I think that's what makes it kind of entertaining. It has 0% on Rotten Tomatoes, and it's been a while since I've seen like an ironic gem like that, so maybe give it a look. The third story in this anthology, bit of a non-starter, because the concept was promising, but there wasn't really enough meat on the bones to make it a satisfying read. So it's called Night Surf, and it's a post-apocalyptic tale about some survivors sacrificing a victim of this pandemic that's called A6, or nicknamed Captain Trips. There's not really much else I can say on this one, really. They reminisce about what life was like before the pandemic, something we as a modern audience can definitely appreciate. There's a twist ending. One of the characters who we thought was immune to the infection goes on to develop it. But then the story ends there, before it's even began. I think a lot of fans admire this story because it's the original template for The Stand, which is Stephen King's like longest and like a fan favourite to many. It's like his longest work. And that makes a lot of sense to me, because the story sort of reads as like a deleted scene from a larger project, but I don't think it stands by itself. Okay, on to story number 4, and it's called I Am the Doorway. Now, this for me was a standout of Night Shift. If you're not going to read the whole anthology, maybe give this one a little hand eye. It's a story about an astronaut. He comes back to Earth. He's done like a long distance trip around Venus. He has a rough landing, and so it like disables him from the waist down, but he's actually got this he's more upset because he's got this itch in his hands and it just won't go away. And I think herein lies the genius of this short story, because we don't know at first what's causing the itch. So we share this like intense feeling of dread at what it could possibly be. Hypochondria, I think, is one of those things that we all go through at some point. We could have the slightest itch, we could have a strange feeling in a part of our body, and we immediately jump into speculation about what could be the cause of it. And I think it's that anxious feeling that makes this story so relatable. We see him go home, he cracks open a medical encyclopedia. He's convinced he has like leprosy because a relative had it. He goes to sleep, he hopes when he wakes up it will go. I feel like we've all shared this sort of nervous reaction. But then this is where it gets a bit wacky. The itching in his hands, it develops into the skin on his hands actually breaking open, and something appears in the cracks, and it's lots of little eyes. He starts to feel this like otherworldly presence from like another dimension even, and he sees the world around him with disgust. He's now horrified by humanity, and these eyes, they're encouraging him to do terrible things, kill people. I enjoyed the fact that King chose the hands as the site of this alien infection, because from like an anatomical perspective, our hands have the highest concentration of peripheral nerves in our body, which is why they're so sensitive to changes and where we get our dexterity from. He knew long before these aliens made themselves known that something was wrong with his hands, and it's that impensing sense of something bad's coming which really affected me. The medical horror of it all. Oftentimes, before somebody has something serious, like a cancer diagnosis for instance, they can feel months in advance this gut feeling that something isn't right. And it's that complex sort of emotional entanglement that King really conveys in such an expert way. Like, he can see the writing on the wall. He knows that he's in too deep. So he takes the only route that's left to him. As his hands are covered in eyes at this point, he burns off both his hands in the hope that this will prevent losing his whole body to them. He mentions how good he's got using hooks to replace his hands, but there's a sadness in his tone, which we see why. He tried to fight it, but they're back. There are eyes now in his chest, and he knows he's going to have to kill himself before they take over. And it's scary how reminiscent this is of patients at hospital going through things like cancer struggles, the trauma of chemo and surgery, only for it to relapse and find out that the cancer spread to like a critical area. This story evokes so much pain, and it's so upsetting that it really does endure as one of my favourites in Night Shift, because it really went there. I think what's interesting as well, and I don't know if this is intentional, but there's a theme running through a couple of these stories of like human sacrifice, you know, like the astronaut shoots himself, Boone doesn't want kids so his bloodline ends, Hall goes down to the sub-basement, and even in Night Surf they sacrifice a guy who's got the infection. Another ongoing theme here is on-screen adaptations that I haven't seen. I know I Am the Doorway was made into a movie, couldn't find it, which is a shame because I think it's one of the more critically acclaimed of the short story adaptations. If you know where I can find it, please drop a link, I'd love to watch it. Now, this might be an unpopular opinion, but I wasn't the biggest fan of the fifth story, titled The Mangler. For me at least, it felt like a more generic version of Kafka's In the Penal Colony, which is also a short story, and it's also about a killing machine. So it starts and we're in a factory. Again, a nice ode to Stephen King's early life. Before he was like a professional writer, he worked in a factory to support his family. We have a folding machine, it's nicknamed the Mangler. It's killed a worker who fell into it by mistake. This starts as a fairly innocent workplace error that quickly devolves into police investigations where they discover more accidents and more accidents related to this machine. And they have some grisly run-ins with it themselves. I think the problem that I had was that it crossed the line from scary into silly. And I'm worried about when I get around to reading Christine, if that book will have like a similar approach. It's just, it happens so quickly that they fall into believing that the machine is possessed by a demon, which started when it cut a virgin girl's finger and got a taste for it. There's this sense, like, if you compare it to Kafka's story, there's willful ignorance, where the characters are talking about the machine with a calmness that's inherently chilling when you know this machine kills people. But in this story, King goes straight to the cliche, like, oh, the machine's possessed. And it got even sillier for me when they performed like an exorcism on the machine. But it like backfires and the machine pulls itself out of the ground and is now on the loose. It's like moving about, this 30-foot long folding machine. Any suspense that I might have felt at the start was completely lost in this moment. I can't picture a 30-foot long folding machine walking down the street hungry for human blood. That is ridiculous. So yeah, wouldn't recommend The Mangler. I think you'd be better off reading In the Penal Colony by Kafka. Funnily enough, this crazy plot has been adapted into a few movies, and I managed to watch the original Tobe Hooper one. If you've watched my Salem's Lot review, you'll remember that Tobe Hooper also directed the 1979 original Salem's Lot, and was for a while considered like the golden boy of horror directors. But I reckon this movie was a bit of a blow to his career. What I've noticed with these short story adaptations is that because the original inspiration is normally not very long, because it's a short story, the movies are either shorts themselves or the directors add their own ideas to pad out the runtime so that they can make a feature-length film. I really didn't like Tobe Hooper's ideas though. He comes up with like this creepy boss that runs the textiles factory, who seems to have something resembling polio, like he walks with leg braces and crutches. And I just think that's such a like damaging, tired visual, and it's really not okay. Like, pop culture loves to perpetuate ableism. Like, we give villains disabilities and deformities, and I just felt this character was like written by a 12-year-old because they were such a cartoon. The movie also features a possessed icebox in addition to the folding machine. And I'm like, why? We already have a machine. Why do we need two of them? Let's not overcomplicate an already fairly basic plot. In spite of all the empty space in the film, there are a lot of scenes where truly nothing's happening. Although the final act, like Graveyard Shift, is pure camp and it's chaotic fun. The two main investigators and the 16-year-old virgin, she's more of a main character than in the book where they just talk to her once. Those three confront the boss and his girlfriend. She's got like this classic 90s bad girl vibe. She's got all this like black leather and textured hair. Oh, everyone in this movie, by the way, has terrible hair, and it was in the 90s, so I don't know why. They defeat them and they feed the villains to the machine. But then the book, they try to do like an exorcism with the Bible, and like the book, the Mangler, it pulls itself out of the ground, and I couldn't believe my eyes. Like, the machine was chasing them, like it sliced one of the guys in half, and it takes a finger off the virgin girl, but then they managed to trick the robot into like falling it down this chute into like the sewers. Truly, words fail me. There's also a twist ending that I hope is addressed in the sequel film, because it's not in the book. The virgin girl becomes the new evil boss in the factory, so she probably brings back the Mangler. So while I didn't like the story itself, the movie adaptation was entertaining enough, and it had like a cool idea of how to end it. And there was a self-awareness to it, so I couldn't be too mad. The next story, titled The Boogeyman, was really good. I think because I went into it with fairly low expectations. I was like, oh, the Boogeyman is like quite a tired horror trope. We've seen so many versions. I figured it would be an uphill battle to elevate that concept. But King did not disappoint. Dr. Harper, he's a psychiatrist and he has an appointment with Lester Billings. Billings talks about how he killed his 3 infant children. What struck me about this story was King's depiction of toxic masculinity and how Billings' fragility as a man, as a father, who refuses to embrace his own emotions, it's actually what feeds the boogeyman. It's his own ego that stops him from letting his first 2 children sleep in the same room as their parents. He expects his infants to overcome their fear of the dark, but then openly admits that his 3rd child, Andy, was his favourite, and he gave him preferential treatment against the boogeyman just because he looks like Billings physically. It's that old idea of the father figure who sees his kids as like a path to immortality and doesn't ever express emotion or sentiment. This is only amplified by the setting of a psychiatrist's office. Traditionally, mental illness was also seen as taboo, that wouldn't be talked about. Men were never supposed to cry. They were never supposed to show vulnerability. So having Billings confess to this psychiatrist, it felt more agonising to him than losing his kids, because he's like such a narcissist. I thought the story was such a clever twist on the boogeyman. Like, you could tell that King had really thought about the symbolism of like the closed closet and how that's like mirrored in these cold, unfeeling men who like the closet never open up. The story has like a fun, again, twist ending. Dr. Harper recommends that Billings make regular appointments with the nurse. Billings goes to the nurse's office and it's empty. When he comes back, Dr. Harper is missing. The closet in his office is slightly ajar, and out comes the boogeyman. He's holding a mask. Dr. Harper was just a disguise so that the boogeyman could listen to Billings. I think this ending is genius, the best twist ending of the anthology. Because like on the surface you think the boogeyman is just playing with Billings, but he's also like reaffirming his old-fashioned views. Throughout the exchange, Billings tells Dr. Harper, "Oh, you're not going to believe me. I must sound crazy." And he's so convinced that being vulnerable in this moment won't solve anything. And so the boogeyman coming out and latching onto him and killing him after he's lost his dignity as this strong, silent type, it's like the boogeyman has caught him at his most intimate moment. Because for a man like this to confide his deepest, darkest thoughts, that's challenging. And the boogeyman, it feels karmic in the sense that Billings wasn't there for his children when they needed him. So now when Billings seeks help in a psychiatrist in his hour of need, that help just escalates into a trap for him. Love this story. Please read The Boogeyman. Without a shadow of a doubt, it was my favourite story out of the 20. There's also a 1982 adaptation. It was actually like a double feature VHS with another story in Night Shift that never made it to DVD. And I think what proved detrimental to the Boogeyman film was The Woman in the Room, the second story. It had a much better director, but we'll get to that when we do Woman in the Room. What I love most about The Boogeyman, though, is the dialogue between Billings and Dr. Harper, because it's so visceral. And I'd argue that most, if not all of that nuance is missing from the film. What I did like, though, is the knowing condescension in the actor who plays Dr. Harper, like his face. Even if you didn't already know the twist ending, you could tell that Harper already knew Billings' situation and enjoyed seeing him be this vulnerable, blubbery man.
Messing around with those? Of course. Did you notice anything else?
About his own culpability and his kid's death. The first 7 minutes, it focuses on how Billings got referred to Harper through the police after his dead son. But that never happened in the story, and so it felt like we wasted like 7.5 minutes in like a 27-minute short. Even in the final scene, we also never see the true face of the boogeyman. Like, the reveal isn't done very well. And that's so intense in the book, because as each child dies, we see more and more of this creature until it's literally staring Billings in the face. So all that suspense was kind of lost in the film. The film was bad, and I'm especially harsh on it because this was my favourite story, without a doubt. They are making, though, a feature-length version of this story, which could be coming out as early as 2023. So I am really looking forward to that because this story just mwah, love. Story number 7, Grey Matter. Like the Ben 10 alien, except no, nothing like the Ben 10 alien. It's about a boy. He runs away from his dad and he arrives at a convenience store. And he tells the man running the store he's afraid of his dad. We find out that his dad, whose name is Richie, has been staying at home since he drank a dodgy beer. One can only suspect that he was infected by some sort of yeast in the beer. And over time, he's become more fungus than human. Richie's son was bringing him beer until he watched his dad, eat a dead cat. So he decided to run away. I think that was a sensible choice. A group of men go to Richie's apartment to confront him, but when he opens the door, they see he's become this amorphous grey blob that's moved on to consuming people in order to divide exponentially. I think this story has a cool concept. At first you sort of take it for granted, it's just like the blob, but it's actually more of like a microbial threat, seeing as Richie avoids sunlight and he feeds himself heated beer. He's definitely some form of fungus. And even after the pandemic, I think people underestimate the threat that microbes pose to us. Antibiotic resistance is an emerging problem that really isn't talked about enough. It could kill millions in the next few generations. So I appreciate how the story ended with the implication that this grey jelly human-eating mass could divide limitlessly and easily outpace humanity. If I was reading too deep, I could argue that King is hinting at the nature of abusive relationships because Richie's a bit of a deadbeat dad, the way he divided copiously as a fungus. That could be an allegory for how abusive behaviour patterns are spread through their victims. I will admit that is a stretch, but it did cross my mind while I was reading that story. But on to the next one, and it's called Battleground. This one's very silly. It's not like the Mangler, which was unintentionally silly. This one was silly in an obvious, this is meant to be a light-hearted breather story. Which sounds weird when I tell you it's about killer toy soldiers, but let me explain. The main character, Renshaw, he's pulled off a successful hit on a toy maker, but then he finds out this package has been delivered to him and it contains lots of G.I. Joe toy soldiers, and for the rest of the story he just has to battle this whole battalion of toy soldiers and their arsenal of weapons and helicopters. Just when you thought it couldn't get any more farcical, something more ridiculous happens. The toy soldiers demand his surrender, but he replies with nuts, which is a reference to I think there was an American general at the Battle of the Bulge. He said something similar to the Germans. And then the soldiers, there's a Molotov cocktail that he throws at them, but then they set off a mini thermonuclear bomb. I was cracking up reading this. It was funny. I think lots of King's earlier work makes reference to the ongoing Vietnam War at the time, but this more than anything felt like a playful dig at how unnecessary that conflict was. Renshaw's a trained hitman, but he can still barely aim at tiny toy soldiers. It was a fun homage to the Americans not being able to crack the guerrilla warfare tactics in Vietnam. I won't get into the on-screen adaptations of this story because toys coming to life has really been done to death. It's so endlessly repeated. We would be here all day talking about films that have taken inspiration or in a similar vein to this story. But on the theme of silliness, our next story is about vehicles coming to life. Sensing a bit of a theme here, right? It's called Trucks, I didn't hate this one as much as the Mangler, but they both deal with inanimate objects coming to life. And it's definitely handled better in this story because our characters are in disbelief and they have to adjust. Instead of the Mangler where they automatically are like, oh, it's a demon, let's do an exorcism. Like, that was bizarre. You can tell in quite a few stories in this, King, in his early work especially, really had a thing for inanimate objects and machines becoming like sentient. I think this sort of came to a head in the 80s when he wrote Christine, but I guess we'll see. So, the trucks. It starts and we're at a diner. That's where we will stay, at the diner, because humans have become stranded. All the trucks outside come to life and they start brutally killing people on the street. I think as well what made me gravitate to this story was that King has actually thought about the logistics of a machine becoming sentient. Like, these trucks quickly cotton on to the fact that they will run out of fuel. And so they stop moving. They use Morse code via horn blasts to tell the diner hostages that one of them needs to come out and pump gas for the trucks. Or a bulldozer is going to demolish the diner and kill everyone. The humans, they try to fight back, but they realise they're outnumbered. So with just 3 people left at this point, they take turns pumping the trucks. And this seemingly happens indefinitely. More trucks arrive from miles around, and it dawns on the 3 humans, this is the new normal. Humans around the world are going to be enslaved to repair and manufacture these trucks. This again is an instance of King sort of criticising the modern world. Like, civilization is just one big concrete jungle. They could only escape these trucks if they hid in caves and swamps, and they were reduced to like the savages of the Stone Age. It's like this cyclical nature of man developing from a primitive creature only to be superseded by his own invention and devolving back into a primitive creature. It's very much like Frankenstein in that sense. Now, this story has 2 different adaptations, but I watched the more famous one, or rather infamous one, the 1997 cinematic disaster Maximum Overdrive. I think this film is held up as an example of the duality of King movies. You know, like for every Shawshank Redemption, like IMDb's top movie of all time, there's a Maximum Overdrive. Like, this is easily the worst Stephen King adaptation I've seen to date. Like, Stephen King was nominated for a Razzie for Worst Director because of this. Like, I think King has also said he doesn't even remember making the film because he was like battling his cocaine addiction around the same time. This film, I hesitate even calling it that because it's just... I mean, I checked the time so often when I was watching it because it felt like it was never ending. There's no plot, except machines have come to life. The opening scene really tells you everything you need to know because this... one of our characters goes to an ATM, and because all machines are now sentient, not just trucks, the ATM prints a special message for him on the screen. In the diner, an electric knife cuts into the arm of a waitress. She just stands there, looking at the wound, screaming. Some trucks show up, and there's this woman, oh, this was the best. She keeps coming outside the diner and yelling at the trucks. She keeps going, "We made you! We made you!" As if these possessed trucks have any sense of loyalty to humans. The guys as well are really experienced with rocket launchers. Like, clearly those weapons were just lying around in the diner. It is America, I guess. And they explode several trucks with these rocket launchers. There's also like this crazy redneck couple who are driving around by the possessed trucks.
We gotta get some gas.
Well, that's good, because I got to go to the ladies.
Can I come in and watch?
No, you can't not come in and watch.
Ouch. Shoot.
and they somehow managed to seek refuge in the diner by like driving at breakneck speed past the rotating blockade and possessed trucks. There's this one truck as well, and you can tell it's the boss truck. It's got this like stupid goblin head on the front, and the movie ended with them destroying said boss goblin truck, and I just shouted, "Good! Now I can leave this god-awful movie." I refuse to go into any more detail because truly one of the worst things I've ever seen. I think Stephen King's direction just proved that he's an amazing writer. That's all I'll say. Next up, we have a story that I really enjoyed because it felt like a gritty departure for King. Sometimes they come back. It reads less like a horror and more like a psychological thriller. It was as if John Grisham sort of took the reins for this one. Our protagonist, Jim Norman, he's an English teacher. He's hanging over his mind. He has like this childhood trauma. He watched his brother get stabbed to death by the school bullies, and this trauma sort of haunts him periodically. But then it all comes to a head when he gets a new job working at this creepy high school. Some of his students die suspiciously, others go missing. They're swiftly replaced with new students who oddly resemble his brother's killers from decades ago. We find out, after killing his brother, these bullies, they died themselves in a car accident, which almost seemed to immortalise them on the school's grounds. They kill Jim's wife. He knows he has to find a way to get revenge, not just for his brother now, but for his wife. So, as you do, he practices some good old-fashioned demonology. He cuts off 2 of his fingers and summons this demon that takes the bully's souls to hell. Or so we hope, as we're told that sometimes demons can return. I really appreciate King's sort of versatility. Not every writer has the range to bounce between irreverent nonsense stories and like gritty reality pieces. Like, we've all been through harrowing experiences in our lives, the kind that replay in the back of our minds before we go to sleep. So to have to relive your worst day, but then use that challenge as a springboard to overcome it, that's a really inspirational story, which manages to be relatable, even though it's so violent and he does summon a demon. Of course, I watched the 1991 TV movie, Sometimes They Come Back. This was a weird one, because it almost wasn't a horror anymore. Like, even the book, even though it's very gritty, there's still horror elements. Like, one of the few movie adaptations I watched where the acting was decent, considering the emotional baggage in depicting someone with childhood trauma. I actually really enjoyed the main actor's performance. I wish I could tell you his name, but whoop. It was funny whenever like we were in the school, because it was a lot like you know, in Greece, where every high school student looks at least over 30. Like, they didn't even try to get adolescent actors. That was what was going on. They also really toned down the visuals in this movie. Like, besides the spirits of the bullies getting bad zombie makeup and the car has flames coming out of it, we don't ever see so much as a drop of blood. There's like a ridiculous scene where they've killed a student, they've dismembered him, and as they throw the little pieces of his body out the car window, none of it's bleeding, like there's no gore. He also doesn't lose his wife in the movie version. And when his brother comes back, he's not like a corrupt demon. Like, everything was very nice. Everything was very PG. I would say it's a fairly mediocre movie. Only watch it if, like me, you're a fan of the story that inspired it. There are 2 sequels as well, somehow. I'm sure they're terrible. Probably won't watch them. Okay, Strawberry Spring. Maybe the worst story in the anthology. I didn't like it. It committed the cardinal sin of being both boring and predictable. It's similar in its inspiration to the Boogeyman, where it takes another classic folklore character, Spring Hill Jack, and gives them a modern reinterpretation. But I think where it diverges from the excellence of the Boogeyman was that it was just off. Like, I'm sure some people out there love this short story, but I didn't really get anything from it. It also wasn't a big reveal. At the end, we find out that the narrator is in fact Spring Hill Jack. He's the murderer. And you could see that twist from a mile away, because the murder still happened after the police locked up their main suspect, and there were no other fleshed out characters. I think I'll leave my coverage of this story here. They're not all winners, and this one just didn't grab me by the throat like some of the other stories did. So yeah, Strawberry Spring. So at this point we're about halfway. So let's move on to our next story, The Ledge. Now, this story is all about the fear of heights, which isn't something that I've personally struggled with, but I can understand, of course, why it's scary. You know, the fear of falling, that's very evolutionary. So this story is actually King's homage to a similar work by Jack Finney called Contents of the Dead Man's Pocket. And I love me some Jack Finney. The Body Snatchers, one of my favourite books, terrified me. So scary. Personally, it's these types of horrors that are much more to my taste. I think it's very 70s to have like a slow burn style of horror. Like, I think of sort of like the film of Rosemary's Baby. The content itself is not explicitly frightening, but the concept, when dragged out, really torments the reader. And that's why I'm looking forward to when I inevitably cover books like Misery and Gerald's Game on this channel, because it's that feeling of helplessness. Standing on the ledge is more impactful to me than the fear of heights or fear of falling, because he has nowhere else to go. He's on this 5-inch ledge. So Stan Norris, professional tennis player, he's having an affair with a married woman called Marcia. And he happens to be in conversation with her husband, a wealthy crime lord. His name is Cressner. Cressner invites Norris to his penthouse suite, and he poses a wager to him. He says, "You walk around the perimeter of my penthouse on the 5-inch thick ledge, and I'll let you run away with my wife and $20,000. A big chunk of the story revolves around the trials and tribulations of the ledge. Like, he can't stay on it for too long, or the muscles in his feet will start to cramp. But there's a lot of wind because he's high up, and this pigeon keeps like pecking at his heel. Could have done without the pigeon, to be honest. It was already a scary picture, just him on the ledge. Adding the bloodthirsty bird sort of took it a bit too far for me. Either way, I enjoyed the ending. Norris makes it all the way around the ledge, but when he gets back to the penthouse, Cressner has already killed his wife, and he's welched on their wager. Norris, who's rightfully fuming, wrestles the gun off Cressner's bodyguard. He commands Cressner to get on the ledge. We're sort of left in suspense, wondering if Cressner manages to pull it off. But Norris says he'll kill him either way. I think what's interesting about this story as well is that the movie adaptation, A Cat's Eye, actually features 3 stories, 2 from Night Shift and a third that was created specifically for the movie. There's like a cat that links all 3 tales together, which is why it's called Cat's Eye. And I'd recommend watching it. It manages to deliver on the horror while still being like light-hearted and like family fun. Because you've got baby girl Drew Barrymore and the most adorable cat. Notable differences in the movie version, Cressner is much more wicked. Like, he throws a lot of curveballs at Norris to try and make him fall off the ledge. At some point, he even starts blasting him with like a hose pipe. When Norris actually completes the ledge walk, Cressner He doesn't even tell him his wife's dead. He throws the bag of money and her head like rolls out.
I'm just an extremely poor loser. I promise you 3 things. You have your car clean, you have the money, and of course, you have my wife.
It was much less subtle than in the book, where he just says, "You'll find my wife at the morgue." Which, whoa. So one of the better stories in my opinion. It takes a universal fear and gives it a modern application. Norris and Cressner, they play off of each other well. Like, Norris is this heroic man who fell in love. He's trying to free Marcia from this maniacal crime lord who is eventually defeated. I forgot as well, Cat's Eye doesn't end on a mystery. Like, we don't wonder if Cressner pulled it off. He falls off the ledge and dies. Because, you know, he's a villain. The next story, The Lawnmower Man. I don't want to talk about it for too long. It read more crazy than scary. Harold Parquet, he needs someone to mow his lawn the year before a cat was killed under his mower by mistake. He sees an ad in the paper for a lawnmower man and he invites him over, like, "Oh, cut my grass." Only to discover that this strange, naked satyr eating the grass, the lawnmower, surprise, surprise, has come to life and it's gone berserk on the grass. Harold faints. He comes to. He calls the police. The lawnmower man chases him, kills him as a sacrifice to the god Pan. The police arrive and the murder is put down to a psycho sex maniac. Maybe I'm just really boring, but this story really lost me. It was so out there. There was no like rhyme or reason. I'm sure a diehard fan out there could spell out the meaning to me. If I really had to make intelligible commentary, I'd probably say that King is like satirising the white picket fence communities of privileged, middle class, often white families who want everything in life to be as mundane and neat looking as their grass. He's illustrating how easily we can invite chaos into our ordinary lives, particularly if we're privileged and wealthy enough to delegate our household chores to strangers. Now, I didn't watch the short film because couldn't find it. I almost watched the 1992 Lawnmower Man with Pierce Brosnan, only to discover it has nothing to do with this story. It just shares a name with King's story. And King even filed a lawsuit against the makers of that film to remove Stephen King's name from both that film and its sequel, which really made me laugh. Quitters Inc. is our next instalment from Night Shift. And I think this is one of the more personal stories to Stephen King because it's about the insidious nature of addiction, something that Stephen King battled himself as well as his personal apprehension around psychiatry and behavioural therapy, which we saw as well in The Boogeyman with Dr. Harper. Richard is a chain smoker, but his friend Jimmy recommends a firm called Quitters Inc., who have a 98% success rate in helping smokers come clean. Excuse me. Richard doesn't seem convinced until months later he hits a rough patch in his job, so he decides to pay the firm a visit. He's put in touch with a quitting counsellor called Donati, who encourages him to sign a contract for aversion training. Richard doesn't really sign the contract. No, I mean, he does sign the contract, but he doesn't, look at it. And he's later horrified to discover that it involves around-the-clock surveillance, so that if he does smoke so much as a single cigarette, either his wife, himself, or even his infant son will be subjected to electric shocks. Richard does well at first for the first couple months, but one day he's in a traffic jam and he relents. He smokes a cigarette. Even though he only takes 3 drags, he's invited back to the firm because his wife has been abducted and she's being shocked. His wife's actually quite supportive when they reconnect. Like, it seemed a bit odd to me. If my husband condemned me to electric shock torture by signing a weird contract, we'd be having words. Like, no, that's not okay.
You're always laughing. Way down there. But what's wrong now?
Richard starts to gain weight, so Donati gives him some unregulated diet pills, and he threatens to remove Richard's wife's finger if he should stray again. The story ends with Richard staying on track. He even recommends Quitter's Ink to a friend, which was like a nice touch. The plot is circular. We started with a referral, ended on a referral. And at dinner, he sees his friend Jimmy has brought his wife, and she is actually missing a finger. Donati was not playing around. I liked this story. The concept was interesting, but it also felt like Stephen King was confronting his own personal demons, like surrounding addiction, but also the more sinister side of psychology. The electric shocks in particular, they're reminiscent of Pavlov's dogs, where classical conditioning was first discovered. King probably finds it dehumanising. It restricts free will to a simple reward-punishment experiment. The idea that if you smoke, I will electrocute you. And this was definitely like one of the more intimate stories in that collection for that reason. Quitter's Ink is also the first story in the movie Cat's Eye with The Ledge. I think the book's version is better. I didn't mind the movie. It did a solid job and it hit all the main plot points. I think it just suffers by being the weakest story of the 3, with The Ledge being second and the third story for sure being the best. I Know What You Need is one of the weaker stories in the anthology. I enjoyed it more than your average fan though. Elizabeth is a college girl. She's struggling to revise for her exams. She has a boyfriend called Tony and a roommate who gives her advice. All of a sudden, this strange looking guy, his name is Ed Hammer Jr., comes into her life and he seems perfect, almost as if he can read her mind. He helps her ace her end of term exams, but she tells him she's got a boyfriend, Tony, because he's coming on a bit strong. Cut to Tony having a very strange accident where he's hit by a car, and it all starts to get a bit weird. Ed shows up more, they start to date. Elizabeth's roommate does some research and tries to warn her about Ed. He has some strange psychic powers. He used them to make his parents wealthy at casinos, and now he's doing it to win your favour. He was probably responsible for that car crash. Elizabeth, she doesn't want to believe that, but when she goes over to Ed's house, she finds voodoo dolls that point to every major manipulation that has been pulled over her. She's of course horrified, and when Ed catches her, he calls her an ungrateful bitch, seeing all this stuff he's done for her. She of course breaks up with him and destroys the voodoo dolls. I can see why this story isn't a standout to most fans, because not a lot happens. The car accident and the dolls are probably the only 2 exciting incidents in the whole thing. It's also mostly like boring 20-something college life. Once again, we're seeing King's disdain for predestination, the idea that you don't have free will because someone's sort of looking out for you and preemptively making decisions for you. That is a scary concept. This is going to sound so terrible, but when her roommate calls their relationship rape, the story probably should have ended with like Ed manipulating her into physical rape. Or since it's the 70s and society is making the women feel worthless, it might have made more sense for her to buckle under Ed and accept this new toxic relationship of him being this psychic overlord to her. I think my issue is the ending, which is a typical complaint for Stephen King. It could have gone further. It could have been so much more disturbing. There is a 2005 short film that I could not for the life of me find, but a trailer was dropped a couple of months ago for a new movie version that's coming soon, so we'll see how that differs from the book. Alright, we're here. The story that's most famous from this anthology, the one that everybody knows because they've made at least a dozen on-screen adaptations. It is Children of the Corn. Funnily enough, I think the movie does a much better job of telling the story than King does. While the story itself is very creative and it's very spooky, there are issues with it that I feel the original 1984 movie corrects a lot of the issues. So it starts. Bert and Vicky, they're driving to California in the hopes of saving their marriage. I suppose the joke here is that couples often have a child in the hope that it will solve their marital problems. And so there's like this irony of them as they travel through Nebraska, they stumble upon a remote cornfield village called Gatlin, and it's inhabited exclusively by children in this creepy Christian death cult. Something that worked much better in the film version was the chemistry between Bert and Vicky. In the book, they're always arguing and they're mistreating each other, so when something bad happens to them, I didn't really care, because they were never likeable from the start, so I didn't warm to them at all. The movie erases all the divorce spiel, and they're actually very happy, they're great friends and lovers, they're adorable together, and I think that was the best change they could have made to the original story, because then I actually cared and was like, oh, I hope they both make it out alive, and when they do, oh, that's satisfying, because it doesn't happen in the book. Their introduction to Gatlin doesn't go very well. They run over a small boy, they think they've killed him, but then they find out that his throat was cut before, and he stumbled out in front of the car while he was already dying. We never see this child again in the book, but the movie actually goes ahead and explains why his throat was cut. He was trying to leave Gatlin because not all the children like this closed-off community of human sacrifices. But on the way out, he was caught by Malachi, who slit his throat. At first, they don't meet any other children. There's like a church full of corn husks and Bible verses. There's also this creepy logbook that has all the births and deaths of the kids. We notice that nobody in Gatlin ever makes it past 19 years old. We find out that all the adults were killed in the town over a decade ago, and that now the town is run exclusively by kids in Amish clothing. Again, the movie starts with a flashback to the killing of the adults in the town's diner. It's one of the more iconic scenes because their leader, Isaac, he pulls a really scary face in the window, and almost all the kids react by killing the grown-ups. Isaac seems to be a prophet. He can talk to their God. I like the subversion of, like, in the Bible, Abraham sacrifices Isaac, but in this story it's the other way around. Isaac is like the prophet who slaughtered Abraham. The children seize Bert and Vicky. They manage to escape, but they tie up Vicky and plan to sacrifice her to their God. Now in the book, Bert finds Vicky hanging on a crucifix with her eyes gouged out. But as the movie shows us a happy relationship, both of them survive in the end. In the book, Bert's also killed by a monster, but because the kids didn't kill him, their god, he who walks behind the rose, he lowers the age limit from 19 to 18. So a bunch of 18-year-olds have to now sacrifice themselves, including Malachi, the ginger one. He's the one who killed the boy at the start. He's also a much bigger character in the film. He even leads like an uprising in the film that results in Isaac being usurped and sacrificed. But then Isaac comes back as like a possessed demon. Ruth, a girl who was pregnant with Malachi's child, she's resentful. She secretly hates their god. Like the movie, there's that sense of not everybody is satisfied with the religion. The movie goes on a bit longer. Bert and one of the little boys set the whole cornfield on fire, which seems to kill the god demon thing that appears during the harvest moon. Bert and Vicky, they adopt the little boy, and there's also a little girl. It's happy ever after for now. I'll probably do like a future video where I'll talk about the million sequels that came from this film, just because it did so well at the box office. And that's why the franchise, I think the most recent Children of the Corn film was in 2020. I think its success comes from a lot of things. Stephen King was clearly making a jab at organised religion and how it indoctrinates followers from such a young age into this cult with untenable beliefs. But there's other things going on here too. The departure from traditional agricultural life being replaced with big city life. Like Bert and Vicky only get there because they're on their way to California. They're going to LA. There's also the growing independence of Gen X kids after their parents had to work hard in post-World War II. There's the overall circle of life. These children would always take the town over once their parents died. They just didn't wait for it to happen naturally. I think this story has a lot of similarities to John Wyndham's Midwich Cuckoos, but it hits harder because in that story, the children are possessed by aliens, so it's very removed from the human experience. In this story, the villain is ideology and how an institution like the Christian Church is able to target minors and exploit them. If you haven't, please watch the original 84 Children of the Corn. It's great. Best movie that I've talked about yet, by a long chalk. Now the next two stories, didn't really like. I'm going to be very quick on them. I'm sorry if you liked them, but they didn't do anything for me. The Last Rung on the Ladder is about siblings. It's like a brother and a sister, and they were close in their childhood, but they drifted apart. Larry was caught up in his job. He wasn't there to support Kitty. She kills herself. The story's sad, but also uncomfortable. Like Larry has like a almost incestuous fascination with his sister's beauty. Didn't care for it. The story after that is The Man Who Loved Flowers, and it's about a man looking for a woman called Norma, who died decades ago, and the grief of losing her has made this man insane. He offers flowers to a random woman, but when he realises that she isn't Norma, he bludgeons her to death with a hammer that's hidden in his bouquet. Again, I'm sorry if you liked those two stories, but for me they were some of the weakest of the bunch, and this video is already very long, so I thought I'd just brush past those two for convenience. Trust me, if you read either one of them, you'd understand why. Like, they don't have major film adaptations, they're not great. On to one that I will talk about in more detail, because it's, again, an homage to Salem's Lot. One for the Road is our penultimate story in Night Shift, and it's actually a sequel to Salem's Lot. It takes place 3 years in the future. Remember, if you haven't watched my review of Salem's Lot, please go watch it. After all, if you got this far, then you must love my content. You must adore me talking about Stephen King. So, as I said, this takes place 3 years in the future, after the events of Salem's Lot. So after, spoiler alert, Ben Mears burnt down the Marston house and the ensuing fire consumed the rest of the town. The locals, who were never turned into vampires, the ones who survived, they live with extreme precaution. They avoid the town centre, they don't go anywhere near it, they wear crucifixes because they know that there are vampires around. There's no disputing it now. A man called Gerard Lumley, he gets stuck in Salem's Lot in a blizzard, and he's lost his wife and his daughter. He seeks refuge in two men by the names of Booth and Tukey. They agree to help him find his family, but they warn that they're probably dead or worse, especially in Salem's Lot. Sure enough, when they do find them, they've both been converted into vampires. Wah, wah. Gerard is then turned by his wife into a vampire. Booth is nearly turned into a vampire by the daughter until Tukey throws a Bible at her and she's like, and they both flee. But Tukey then dies of a heart attack a few years later because the incident was very stressful. And Booth closes the story by warning us, like, stay away from Salem's Lot, even though it's not a real town. I liked this story. I think that Jerusalem's Lot, the first one in this anthology, was better because it adds new mythos to the universe of Salem's Lot. Like, this story is great, but it only adds to what we already know at the end of Salem's Lot. It doesn't help that we don't get a single reference to the original Salem's Lot. I really would have appreciated it. It would have been way cooler if a character made a cameo or something, hint at Barlow, hint at Father Callahan. We never really found out what happened to him. Are either of them still alive? It's weird to me that this is a sequel that was written after the original, but the only common denominator is they both mention the town name of Salem's Lot. That feels weird to me. Now, our final story in Night Shift, and it's appropriately about the end of life itself. The woman in the room tells the very upsetting tale of Johnny, who euthanises his terminally ill mother by overdosing her with painkillers. As someone who lost my own grandmother earlier in the year to dementia, this story was personally very upsetting and quite a powerful full stop on Night Shift. Even today, people still discredit Stephen King for writing horror. Many see it as like a nonsense genre. So I think it's smart of him to slip in these stories that show him off as a serious writer, even though horror itself is also serious writing. He can write about difficult topics without it devolving into just another horror script. And I think that sentiment really comes across in his story. Like, it's very raw. Frank Darabont, not sure if I'm saying his name right, you might have heard of him. He directed The Mist, he directed The Green Mile, and most famously, of course, he directed The Shawshank Redemption. All Stephen King adaptations. This was his first collab with Stephen King. He wrote a letter to him in 1980 saying, like, hey, I like the story, can I adapt it? And he created this really good short from it. Like, the dialogue especially was really moving.
I think I'll sleep now, Johnny.
You'll do it.
It's also part of that VHS that we talked about earlier with the Boogeyman, and it's brilliant. And it really predicts the meteoric success that Darabont and King would have together on future projects. And we've made it. That's Night Shift, Stephen King's first ever short story collection. It's a great book. It's touted by many as the best short story collection by King. So it only goes down here from here, folks. Thank you for watching, and if you made it all the way to the end, then I am so grateful to you. And with that, I have one last thing to say. Toodaloo.